Hello everyone, welcome to this new video on the subject of miracles with Dr. Craig Keener, who is joining me once again. In the first episode, we did a video on the historical reliability of the Gospels, and today we're doing a second episode on the question of miracles, because as you know, the Gospels contains a lot of miracles, and skeptics tend to object that miracles are not very credible historically and that we have no reason to believe in them. And so in this presentation, Craig Keener is going to give us some well-evidenced, some well-attested miracles that happen in the modern era. So thank you, Craig, for coming and welcome to the show.
It's always a privilege to be with you, and thank you so much for having me here. I wanted to start with the account of Barbara Snyder in Illinois. Doctors had sent her home to die. She had a very severe and advanced case of multiple sclerosis. After 15 years, about half of which she'd spent in hospitals, she no longer could breathe without being hooked up to a machine. She had gone blind. She, in her words, was curled up like a pretzel. And then suddenly she heard a voice. People had been praying for her, so I'm kind of condensing the story, but at the moment, it was just some friends who were visiting her. When she heard a voice off to the side, off to where her friends weren't, calling her to rise up and walk, she jumped out of bed, which was physically impossible for her. And then the first thing she noticed was she could see her feet flat on the floor, which her feet hadn't been able to be flat on anything for years. Second thing she noticed was that her hands weren't curled up anymore. And the third thing that she noticed was she was actually seeing these things with her eyes. She began pulling the tubes out. She ran to greet her father. So normally, if you're healed from something, but you haven't walked for years, your muscles are still atrophied. But in this case, the healing was so complete, she actually was able to run and greet her father. All three of her doctors published on this. I interviewed two of them and got the message directly from them. All of them agree that there's no other way to explain this except as a miracle. This wasn't a temporary remission. That was 1981. She lived on for 40 more years until a few years ago she passed away from COVID. But she had no recurrence whatsoever of multiple sclerosis. Miracle and exorcism accounts comprise over half of Mark's narrative before the Passion, roughly 1/5 of the book of Acts, and they're a common reason for skeptics doubting the historicity of Mark and Acts and similar works that include many miracles, because they say, well, we know miracles don't happen, so these accounts can't be true. But that's like getting the cart before the horse. How do we know that miracles don't happen? So usually I write commentaries. Usually I focus on just scripture itself and the historical context and historical reliability. I work as a historian mostly. But in this case, I said, well, no, I need to investigate this. Why do they say these things don't happen when I know people who have experienced such things? So I wrote a couple books on this. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because sometimes they've been misrepresented, like, okay, Keener doesn't know anything about this subject. So I just wanted to show you that I actually did do the research. The first book, I had over 4,000 sources in my bibliography. In the shorter book, the more popular level one, I cite more than 80 doctors by name, more than 135 cases with at least some level of medical verification. I cite 40 eyewitnesses with non-medical doctorates, in case somebody says, well, none of these people are educated. I knew 61% of the people I interviewed personally, and in more than 40% of the cases, I was able to access multiple witnesses. In a few of the cases, I was a witness myself. So it's not like I didn't do anything to check into these things. Most of the people who deny that miracles happen ultimately depend on the argument of David Hume. Sometimes they say, well, David Hume settled this. or sometimes they don't know who they think settled it, but they just vaguely know somebody settled this a long time ago. Hume was really rehashing earlier deist arguments, as was shown in the dissertation by Robert Burns. His basic argument is there are no credible eyewitnesses for miracles. Nobody who claims to be an eyewitness counts as credible. That's a super quick one. I'm skipping over a lot of his argument, but his argument from nature seems to depend on his argument from eyewitnesses, and his idea that miracles are against nature actually depends on a conception of natural law that's been out of date for a couple centuries now. But Hume rejected, for example, the healing of the niece of Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal's niece had a running eye sore, and it emitted a foul odor. Everybody knew about it, but it was instantly and publicly healed in the sight of many witnesses when she was touched with a holy thorn from Jesus' crown of thorns. Now, personally, I don't believe it was really from Jesus' crown of thorns, but it was a contact point for her faith. She was instantly and publicly healed. The Queen Mother of France sent her own physician to check it out. How did Hume deal with this? Hume said, well, we know this didn't happen. Why would we believe anything else? But of course, Hume could get away with that because most of his audience were Anglicans or Presbyterians who at that time didn't like testimonies from French Catholics. There have been a number of recent major philosophic challenges to Hume on miracles, published by Cambridge, Cornell, Oxford, and elsewhere. The one published by Oxford, a reviewer said, the author of this book just doesn't like Hume's argument about miracles because the author is a Christian. To which the author responded, actually, I'm not a Christian. I just thought it was a really bad argument. Eyewitness testimony is considered a valid form of evidence in sociology, anthropology, law, journalism, and of course, historiography, where I work. And in some of these cases, especially in the West, we also have medical records available. One principle that I'm following in surveying these is that a smaller number of eyewitnesses should count more heavily than a greater number of skeptical non-witnesses. What I mean by that is, we would apply that to most other kinds of claims. I mean, if a police officer is interviewing witnesses in an accident and someone comes up and contradicts the others and says, wait, that didn't happen. And so the officer says, well, can you tell me what you saw happen? And the person says, well, I didn't see anything happen. I wasn't there. That's why I know it didn't happen. We probably wouldn't take that claim very seriously. We should prefer the argument of witnesses to those who say, well, I never saw a miracle, therefore they don't happen. Are there some credible eyewitnesses for miracles today? So I want to give some samples from various parts of the world. For example, Wansuk and Julie Ma, who are friends of mine. They used to teach, actually Wansuk was the director, they used to teach at Oxford Center for Mission Studies. And among the accounts they have is one where they visibly, and other witnesses visibly, saw a large goiter instantly disappear during prayer. Years ago at Rose Lane Nursing Home, so this was just a few years after my conversion from atheism, my brother Chris and I were helping at a Bible study at the nursing home. And there was a woman named Barbara, not to be confused with the Barbara I mentioned earlier. Barbara always came in a wheelchair, and every time she would come to the Bible study, she would say, I wish I could walk, I wish I could walk. And the Bible study leader, one day, he said, I'm tired of this, walked over to her, grabbed her by the hand, lifted her from the chair and said, in the name of Jesus, rise up and walk. If faith is a bias, I cannot be accused of it in this case because I was sure she was going to fall on the floor. And from the expression on her face, I think she expected the same thing. But instead, he walked her around the room. And from then on, Barbara would come to the nursing home. She lived in the nursing home. From then on, Barbara would come to the Bible study saying, I love this Bible study. I love this Bible study. She would walk on her own. And my brother, Chris, we were both younger back then. Neither of us had PhDs, but in terms of those who think you have to be educated, Chris later did his PhD in physics, and of course I did mine in New Testament and Christian origins. There have been major academic studies on this, published by Oxford and others, on healing accounts globally. There was a Pew Forum survey in 2006 of Pentecostals and charismatics in just 10 countries. Now, in the survey, they were including only Protestant charismatics, which seems to me to be a bias. But anyway, you go through these 10 countries. For these 10 countries alone, and for the Pentecostals and Protestant charismatics in these 10 countries alone, it comes out to around 200 million people who claim to have witnessed divine healing. And more surprising is the control group that they used, which was just other Christians. So Catholics, Orthodox, and other, somewhere around 39% of the other Christians in these 10 countries claim to have witnessed divine healing. We're talking, therefore, about hundreds of millions of people around the world who claim this. Now, one survey of US doctors who were probably more qualified than, well, they are definitely more qualified than the average among us to say whether something is medically unusual or not, but nearly 3/4 of US doctors believe in miracles as in biblical times, and over half noted that they had witnessed what they considered to be miracles in this sense. Now, the point is not what proportion of these claims involve genuinely divine activity or miracles. Nobody would claim that every claim is genuine. Nobody would say that all of these can only be explained as miracles. But the point is, Hume can't start legitimately from the premise that uniform human experience excludes miracles when you've got hundreds of millions of counterclaims. And I don't think Hume would do that himself today in view of this kind of information. So if not, we need to explore claims rather than to dismiss them. Millions of non-Christians in our own lifetime, millions of non-Christians have been convinced. So they're not starting with a Christian bias or to make Christianity look good. These are people who changed centuries of ancestral beliefs because of extraordinary healings, because of something that was different than what they were accustomed to, maybe in terms of their folk traditions or other things. Some suggest that 70% of global Christian growth in the last few decades has been due to this. China was not one of the 10 countries surveyed above, but in the 1990s, there was a report from within the China Christian Council attributing roughly half of all conversions over the previous 20 years to what they called faith healing experiences. One house church estimate comes closer to 90%, at least in rural areas. So these aren't people who started with Christian premises, but people who were so convinced that they became Christians. And we have accounts of many who haven't become Christians yet because of the social cost, but who still witnessed or experienced these things. Dr. Balkrishna Sharma shared with me that 80% of converts in Nepal are due to signs and wonders, especially healings and deliverance from spirits. Dramatic miracles today most often take place in the same settings that we see them in the Gospels and Acts. Groundbreaking evangelism in relatively new areas. Of course, God may answer prayer anywhere, and like the account I gave of Barbara Snyder, sometimes God does dramatic miracles here as well. But special signs most often are reported during evangelism in less evangelized regions or in power encounters where there are indigenous healing traditions attributed to other spirits. Now, this is something in the past as well, and I know. I think you'll enjoy this part. You can hear me, all right? Right?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So In the past, rabbis associated not only Jesus, but also his followers with healing miracles. Irenaeus, writing somewhere around the year 180, lists almost the same range of miracles as we see in the book of Acts happening in his day, and notes that many conversions were due to this. Tertullian, writing to the Roman government, named prominent pagans who were delivered from demon possession, who were grateful to Christians. And he says, look, we do so much good for the Roman Empire. And if you don't believe me, just bring any demonized person and bring any Christian at all, and that Christian can immediately expel that demon in the name of Jesus. And if they can't, execute that Christian as a fake. Phew. Tertullian had really high standards. I'm not sure how many of us would pass that today, but the name of Jesus can always pass it. Other early examples, Origen testified that he had witnessed healings and exorcisms. In the 300s, Ramsay MacMullen, professor emeritus of history at Yale University, discovered that in the 300s, the main cause of conversion to Christianity was due to healing and exorcism. Cyprian wasn't alone in this, but Cyprian noted that Christians were sometimes healed during their baptism. We also have the accounts of Anthony and desert monks. We look back to Athanasius for his emphasis on the Trinity and other theological battles that he fought and successfully. But he also wrote a biography of Anthony, who was a desert monk, and the healings and exorcisms and miracles that took place through his ministry, fairly contemporary. Augustine originally thought, okay, well, miracles aren't happening so much today. He knew of some that happened when Ambrose was bishop, but in Milan. But Augustine noted that after just 2 years of actually looking for these things, he had collected 70 solid affidavits about miracles in his own diocese alone that included healings of blindness and raisings from the dead. Augustine was healed of an intractable tooth problem, which may not sound too big to us because we have good dentists, but in his day, they didn't have root canals and things like that. He also was an eyewitness to the healing of his friend who had anal fistulas. Back then, people sometimes bled to death during operations. They didn't have anesthesia. Innocent was wailing, God, please heal me, please heal me. And Augustine was like, God, this is distracting. He's crying out so much. But if you don't hear this, what would you actually hear? But the next day when they went into the surgery, the surgeons removed the bandages and the fistulas had completely disappeared. We mentioned Blaise Pascal's niece. Jesus appealed to eyewitness evidence. He said, go and tell John what you've seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them. Well, all these things happen today too. For example, the blind receiving their sight. We have examples of that, a number of examples at Lourdes. And I hope I'm saying the French words right. My wife is francophone and she laughs at my French. But anyway, Francis Pascal he was cured of complete blindness at the age of 3 years in 1938. Marie Bigot, if I'm saying her name right, was cured of blindness, deafness in 1954. And there are other examples of that. It still happens today. In 2020, in a peer-reviewed journal, a case with the before and after medical documentation was published of spontaneous healing when a husband just in desperation, he cried out to God for his wife who'd been blind for 12 years. Instantly, she could see. Now, it was a case of something that was organic, and of course, they were able to publish it in the medical journal because it was so extraordinary. Greg Spencer was legally blind due to macular degeneration. He was healed at a prayer retreat. He asked to get off disability, and noting that macular degeneration doesn't undegenerate, the government instead said, we're going to investigate you for fraud. You must never have been blind. But it turned out all the medical documentation was there. I've crossed out the names, even though this is public now, but just in the US, privacy laws were not supposed to include the names. So, but I have all the medical documentation that verified his case. And the government eventually had to recognize, in light of all the documentation, they said, well, you received a remarkable return of your visual acuity. You are no longer qualified for disability. So had to go back to work. Cases of the disabled walking. I'm just giving a few examples of this. Obviously, we could give many more. But Miguel Pellicer, I also don't know how to pronounce Spanish very well, but in 1637, his leg was amputated beneath the knee, as testified by the two surgeons. He was widely known for his begging with his wooden leg. So, I mean, lots and lots of witnesses in at least two different cities who saw his condition. In 1640, he awoke with a restored leg. 24 witnesses testified. We still have the documentation today. This is the kind of thing for which skeptics come up with really, really, really interesting explanations, which I find far more remarkable than just the idea that it was a miracle. One actually said, well, maybe there's some natural process in which a leg can grow back overnight that we just haven't discovered yet. In the 1970s, Lisa Larios had hip cancer that had metastasized. Her mother hadn't told her yet that she was dying, or even that she had cancer, which was less curable back in the 70s than it is now. Hadn't told her that she had this condition. All she knew was she couldn't walk. She was in a wheelchair. They took her to a prayer service. And during the prayer service, actually, the person who was leading it felt led like somebody's being healed of cancer in their leg. And Lisa didn't even know that she had cancer, but suddenly she bolted out of her wheelchair and started running around, which had been impossible before. And it not only shocked her mother, but she shocked her father, because when she returned, she was pushing a wheelchair, and then she got on her bike and started riding around. The medical documentation after her healing shows that not only did she no longer have cancer, but where the cancer had eaten away her bones had been restored. Bruce Van Natta, now people sometimes say, how come you never have an appendage growing back? Just, ignoring the one with Mr. Pellicer. Well, Bruce Van Natta is a modern example of something similar to that. He was an auto mechanic working under a diesel truck when the axle gave way and crushed his abdomen down to close to within an inch of the ground. The emergency people, when they got there, they thought that he'd already bled out, that he was already dead, but he wasn't dead. Well, he did have a vision of angels, but anyway, the doctors were able to save his life, but it seemed like it was going to be temporary because so much of his small intestine had been destroyed that there wasn't really enough left for him to be able to digest any food. He was slowly starving to death. He dropped from 180 pounds to 125 pounds. When one of his friends felt led to fly to him in person in the hospital and pray for him, and when he prayed for him, Bruce felt something like an electric jolt. And after that, he was able to eat and digest food, and the radiologist was able to determine that his small intestine, what was left of it, had way more than doubled in length. Now, the small intestine can widen, but can't naturally grow longer in an adult. So this is the equivalent to an amputated appendage growing back. Now, this one didn't get published in a medical journal because to actually be able to publish it, you'd have to be able to measure the length of his small intestine, which means you would have to unroll it, which would kill him, which effectively defeats the purpose of the miracle. But after this happened to Bruce just developed this compassion for other people who were ill, began praying for other people. And one of the people he prayed for did make it into a medical journal. This was somebody who had gastroparesis from the time that he was a baby. And what that involved was projectile vomiting. He couldn't take food in through the regular digestive system. He had to be fed through a feeding tube directly into his stomach, because if you put anything into his mouth, he'd vomit it immediately so violently, could vomit it up against a wall. And after about half an hour of prayer, this young man was healed. After 18 years of this condition, he was healed, was able immediately to go out and eat at a fast food restaurant. And after further observation, the doctor said, this guy is completely better, whatever the reasons, took out the tubes, and he has himself gone into health care because he wanted to give back for all the good years that the medical establishment gave to him. Now, also, Jesus says, you see, lepers are healed. Now, ancient leprosy, the way it's meant in the Bible, it's a skin disease that's a lot more general than what we normally mean today by leprosy, Hansen's disease. But even Hansen's disease, which is a really severe condition, more than often ancient leprosy, well, more than what we often call ancient leprosy was. But this also has gotten healed. So obviously the condition that we call leprosy today, Hansen's disease, is more common in India. But I talked with one of my former students, Dr. Ebi Paran Barrage, who worked with somebody named Bari Malto in India. Bari Malto was a shaman before his conversion, and he was cast out of the village because of his leprosy. Well, a couple ladies came by and prayed for him one night, and one day, and that night, Bari Malto, in his dream, angels touched his hands. He woke up completely healed. He walked into the village. The entire village became followers of Jesus. And by the time my friend and former student got there to work with him, half that region had already become followers of Jesus. In terms of the deaf hearing, Jesus says, well, the deaf hear also. This one is in a book by Dr. Rex Gardner, Healing Miracles. Rex Gardner also published some of his accounts in the British Medical Journal a generation ago. But he gives one account of a 9-year-old girl who was deaf without her hearing aid, but was praying for healing. She was instantly healed. The parents called the audiologist, and he said, wait, I just tested her the day before. There's no way. This can't happen because this was due to auditory nerve damage that doesn't just go away. But he tested her again, and sure enough, her hearing was normal. And he testifies this has to be called a miracle. Now, obviously, the area of the medical expertise is more important than whether the doctor would call it a miracle or not, but just that there's no other explanation for it, he or she can verify. Eyewitnesses, some of whom I know, recount the healings of large numbers of deaf non-Christians in Jesus' name in Mozambique, leading to massive church growth. So they'll go into a completely unchurched village, share the gospel, and pray for people. And so many people are healed that the next day, the completely non-Christian village says, we want a church here. So it's led to massive church growth. And these are people who care for orphans, they care for the blind and the deaf who don't get healed. So they try to care for everybody holistically. Well, there was a medical team that went there to investigate this, and they published the results in September of 2010 in the Southern Medical Journal. And there it's clear that people went from what we would consider legal deafness to hearing, from legal blindness to seeing. Now, some people complained, especially online. They said, how can you talk about this happening? Testing conditions in rural Mozambique aren't ideal. But Professor Candy Gunther Brown, who was one of the authors of the study, published a book later on in 2012, published by Harvard University Press, called Testing Prayer. She has a chapter in that book on this study in which she was one of the people who was examining. And it's pretty clear from this chapter that these people actually went from blindness to seeing and from deafness to hearing. Now, I like to talk about what Jesus says next. He says, John the Baptist, tell John the Baptist, the dead are raised. I like to examine this category of healings because people usually don't think of the dead as being merely psychosomatically dead. After 6 minutes without oxygen, irreparable brain damage starts in. And we have this category multiply attested in the New Testament and early church history. So Matthew and Luke, some of their shared material, Jesus talks about the dead being raised. Sounds like it happens more than once. We have it with Jairus' daughter in Mark 5, with the widow of Nain's son in Luke 7, with Lazarus in John 11, and Quadratus, who was a bishop in the early 2nd century, said that some of those that Jesus raised from the dead remained alive into his own day. Also, there was a Syrian evangelist, I believe by the name of Adai, and he raised somebody from the dead around the year 100, and one of the people converted later became a bishop in Mesopotamia. And actually you have Irenaeus saying, you Gnostics, you don't have anything on us. Look, we Christians, God gives us signs and wonders. So writing around the year 180, he says, we've got this church here in France where people get raised from the dead periodically, like not just once. Augustine includes that among his official reports where he had affidavits from witnesses in his diocese. You have some well-documented medieval reports. So a drowned girl who was unrecognizably bloated, where the father had to pry open her mouth with a knife to put the tongue back in. 40 people prayed until midnight as the parents laid the body on the altar at the church, and she got up alive. We have accounts like this, and people say, they were medieval. These are eyewitness accounts from the time when it happened. But if you don't like those, we have more recent ones too. So jumping to a fairly recent one from this century, Dr. Chauncey Crandall, cardiologist in West Palm Beach, was making his rounds in the hospital when he was called in to sign a death certificate because in the ER, Jeff Markin, an auto mechanic, had been pronounced, well, he had died. He had been flatlined for 40 minutes. They'd done everything they could to revive him, followed all the American Heart Association protocols. Crandall was convinced the person was dead, signed the death certificate. As he was going back to making his rounds, he felt like the Holy Spirit was leading him to go back in and pray for this man to have a second chance to know the Lord. Obviously, that does not happen very often, but in this case, it did happen, and Markin was restored. And even though Dr. Crandall told me that Jeff Markin's face and hands had turned black from cyanosis, he wasn't just dead, he was very obviously dead. He didn't have brain damage. And this is a picture that Dr. Crandall sent me of Dr. Crandall helping participate in Jeff Markin's baptism. Dr. Sean George in Australia, a consultant physician in Kalgoorlie, he had a heart attack. So he himself ends up being, this time it's the doctor's own testimony of his own case. He had a heart attack, no natural respiration for an hour, that is, no respiration on his own. When his wife, Sherry Jacob, who was also a physician, arrived, She prayed. She was told to say her goodbyes to him, but she prayed. His heart restarted spontaneously. Now, it was 3 days later before he awoke, but he awoke with no brain damage. His Muslim and Hindu medical colleagues agreed that this was a miracle. And this is public information. He still has the defibrillator logs posted online showing his condition. This next one was a testimony from my neighbor. I've got so many accounts of this, but I have this picture with myself and my neighbor to let you know to close your eyes. And the next picture, in case you pass out at the sight of blood. This wasn't what happened to my neighbor, but what happened to his friend. His friend Yusuf's neck was clearly cut, and this is after the body had been moved. There was more blood in the original scene. He looks fairly dead to me, but the people who are transporting him to the hospital probably didn't think he was very alive either, given the way they were transporting him. But he had an experience of Jesus sending him back into his body. And in the hospital, they discovered, oh, he's alive after all. They did have to sew his neck, just like Jacob had a limp after his experience with the angel. But he's alive and well to testify about it. My friend Leo Bawa, and I don't want to overwhelm with too many accounts, but just when I was researching the first book on miracles, I found a lot of my friends in Africa had accounts. So I asked Leo, whom I'd worked with during my 3 summers in Nigeria at that point, and Leo was a research officer for a mission there in Nigeria. Later did his PhD. But Leo, I said, do you have any miracles that you've seen? And he said, not very many. He sent me just 7 pages, but one of them was an account of a village where he was, and he was asked to pray for a neighbor child who had died. And he prayed for a few hours and then handed the child back to his parents alive, which I found to be rather impressive. I have a number of examples from Congo Brazzaville, which is where my wife is from, including from the pastor here in this picture, but I'm going to skip that one for the sake of time and go on to actually from Jeanne Mabiala. I had 3 accounts from her. She's a close friend of the family, and just do one of these where, and actually there are multiple witnesses for some of these, including my brother-in-law for one of them. But in one of the cases, there was a baby that was born dead. Jeanne Mabiala was a nurse midwife trained by the World Health Organization, and the baby was born gray. Apparently had died in the mother's womb during the night with the umbilical cord wrapped around the child's neck. So while the father went out to make a coffin for the baby, Mama Jeanne prayed along with 2 ladies there, a Protestant and a Catholic, and they prayed together. And by the time the father came back in from making the coffin, the child was alive. And they named her Mille Grâces, 1,000-fold grace, and she's doing well. I especially wanted to tell this one from Congo Brazzaville, though. This one is the account that was given to me by Antoinette Malombe, and I heard about it before I met her, but it was really good for me to meet her and interview her directly. She shared with me that when her daughter Therese was about 2 years old, Therese was bitten by a snake. She stopped breathing, and Madame Jacques, as we call her, she didn't, there was no medical help available in the village. So Madame Jacques strapped the child to her back and ran to a nearby village where family friend Coco Ngoma Moise was doing ministry. Coco Moise prayed for the child, and the child started breathing again. The next day she was fine. And I asked, how long was it that she wasn't breathing? And Madame Jacques had to stop and think. And she said, to get from this village to that village, it was about 3 hours. Now, again, 6 minutes with no oxygen, irreparable brain damage starts in. But Therese had no brain damage. She's close to my age. She finished a master's degree in Cameroon. So all that to say, that one really got my attention. It's not by any means the most dramatic, not the most documented, but that one got my attention because Therese is my wife's sister, and Antoinette Molambe was my wife's mother. Unless we're burying too many people prematurely, how often would you say that we simply misdiagnose death? I mean, sure, sometimes we probably do. But what are the odds of any given person knowing somebody who witnessed a raising based on such a coincidence? My wife and I personally know 10 people who witnessed or experienced this. So, I mean, what are the odds of those all being just misdiagnosis? The probability, I think, is so low that it seems to me a whole lot smarter to just say, maybe miracle, one God is a simpler explanation. So the traditional argument against miracles, David Hume's argument, an analogy based on analogy. Well, if these things ever happened, we'd see them happen. They don't happen, so they never happened. That's really misinformed about global realities. So we do have reason to believe in those things, but just briefly, what's the point of all these things for those of us who are believers? When Jesus sent the message to John the Baptist, he said, the blind see, the deaf hear, the disabled walk, and he also says, good news is preached to the poor. He's evoking two different passages from the book of Isaiah. Both of them in context talk about the restoration of God's people and all of creation. Well, obviously, the fullness of that is still future, but the foretaste of it was already happening through Jesus' ministry. He inaugurated God's reign, inaugurated God's kingdom. So as the king has already come and is yet to come, we have a foretaste of the kingdom, even though the fullness of the kingdom is still future. And all that to say that, yeah, sickness and death do remain in the world. You may be able to tell by my voice, I'm getting over a cold. But when God heals anybody, it's a gift to all of us because it's a reminder of God's promise of a world made new. God hasn't forgotten to give us reminders of that promise. We just need to remember it cost Jesus everything to make that available to us. We also need to remember that in the Christian worldview, there's something deeper than miracles. Miracles are wonderful. They show us God's care. They show us God's power. They're a foretaste of a future promise. But something that goes deeper than that is the message of the cross. Because in the cross, God reminds us that even when it looks like darkness and death and tragedy and injustice have prevailed, God is still at work to bring about his purposes.
Well, thank you, Craig. That was amazing. That was an amazing presentation. Lots of documentation, primary sources, and even lots of eyewitnesses that you've personally met. So that's some very, very good research. So I recommend everyone buy your book, Miracles Today. And if you want to go deeper and have even more evidence for miracles, buy the two big volumes, Miracles, that came out in 2011, I think, which are very, very good too. And so a few questions would be, the first one would be, what is your favorite miracle amongst the ones you've listed? Is there anyone that's particularly the most impressive one to you, or like name some of them if you have, if it's multiples? What would be the most impressive?
It wouldn't be the most impressive to everybody, but the most impressive to me personally, most impactful to me personally, was the raising of my sister-in-law. But
Okay.
that's me personally. There are a number, even even since the book Miracles Today came out, I've personally witnessed a couple where I was present. And one of them, in Miracles Today actually has some more updated ones, with some cases where I got the reports from the doctors and so on that weren't in the earlier one. But the earlier one, of course, has more of a philosophic response to Hume. But just maybe a couple years ago, so shortly after the second Miracles book came out, I was at a conference. It was an academic conference. We were talking about healing and the work of the Holy Spirit and so on. And a woman came. I guess she knew it was an academic conference, but she still thought, since they're talking about healing, maybe I can go there. She had a condition where something, I don't know if it was her optic nerve or her brain, but her eyesight had become polarized. So her eyes were looking in different directions. And so she had to have a patch over one side of her glasses because she couldn't see through both eyes at the same time. And the doctor had told her that this wasn't something that could go away instantly. Doesn't usually ever go away, but if it did go away, it would take months. And she asked us to pray for her. And we said, well, this is an academic conference, but why not? We're looking to the Lord. He's the one who heals. So we asked him. And she went back and sat down, and we went back to our conversation. And suddenly she runs up to the front because she'd been hesitant to take her glasses off. She was scared to see what would happen, but she ran up. She said, I can see perfectly. So when she told her normal doctor, he said, he was all for it. He said, that's a miracle. But what she told her neurologist, he was the one who said, this can't go away. Or if it does go away, it'll take months. She said, didn't you say it would take months if this ever went away? He said, that's right. She said, mine went away instantly. He said, oh, that's impossible. And then he started taking notes.
Yeah. And in terms of numbers, what would you say? You said it was like 200 million claims of witnessing miracles. I think it's like 20th century or 21st century. Is that right?
I think that was around 2006 that was published. And it was just 200 million among Pentecostals and Protestant charismatics in just 10 countries. And then 39% of Christians other than those. So Catholic charismatics, other Catholics, Orthodox, and others, and Protestants who don't claim to be charismatic. So just in those 10 countries. So, I mean,
Yeah, it would be
200
more than
million
that.
is really low estimate.
Yes, and so if you were to make a more general estimate of the numbers of eyewitness testimonies to miracles in history since the time of
Yeah,
Christ, we would get perhaps like a billion witnesses, I believe.
maybe.
So that's we're not claiming here that all of these accounts are necessarily true.
Right,
We're making a probabilistic argument.
right,
What is the probability that every single one of these cases are false? Like from a Bayesian mathematical
right.
perspective, suppose that the probability of each case being false is very high, like 0.9999999. Well, if you do 0.99999 to the power of 200 million or to the power of 500 million, you would still get the conjunction, the probability of the conjunction being false being very, very low.
Yes.
And so that's actually a good probabilistic argument for the truth of the supernatural.
Yeah. My brother Chris, whom I said did his PhD in physics later on, I asked his help. I didn't want to trust my own mathematical calculations, but I asked his help to do some numbers crunching on the probability of all the 10 people that we know who have witnessed or experienced being raised, that all those were just misdiagnosis, unless we're burying too many people prematurely. And he and his daughter and I, we came to, just using the most minimal uh, possibility. So at least the chances are like 1 in 10 billion. So in other words, the odds of that are very, very low, that those are all just misdiagnosis of death.
Yeah, and I would say that it's a pity that atheists and especially philosophers in academia who work in philosophy of religion, things like that, don't even deal with the concrete evidence we have for miracles. They don't look at the particular cases. They just repeat Hume, 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 and they don't even try to go respond. Okay, well, please explain to me this case and the apparitions of Zaytun and the miracles of
Right,
Lourdes and
right,
the Eucharistic miracles and the conjunction of all these independent miracles that needs to be adequately explained. They don't do this type of research, and yeah, to me it's a pity because it would be a massive breakthrough in natural theology and just arguments for God's existence to argue this way, and perhaps it's going to come in the near future. I hope that philosophers will be more interested in that in the near
some are.
future. But yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, some are.
some are right, and I interviewed actually some who believe that. And in terms of probabilistic calculations, Tim McGrew, in
Hmm.
his article, I think on Miracle in the online Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, deals some with Bayesian calculations too, but um, looking more at Hume's argument. Actually, Bayes' theorem, the mathematicians who came up with that were originally designed it to refute Hume's argument about miracles.
Really? Okay,
Yeah.
it's interesting. Yeah. So, guys, just read John Ehrman's book, Hume's Abject Failure. It's not written by a Christian. It's an honest atheist who found out that Hume's methodology and argumentation on miracles was actually pretty weak. So we will refer you to this book if you want to go deeper. But anyways, thank you, Craig, for coming on this channel to speak about these wonderful miracles. Is there anything you want to add before we close the show?
Yeah. Some people have responded to some cases, but like when you look at the responses, I mean, there was one case. I'll just use this one as one example. We could give plenty of others, but there was a woman, Delia Knox, who had been a gospel singer for years, singing from her wheelchair because she was injured, paralyzed from the waist down in an automobile accident. For 22 years, she was in that condition. When she was suddenly healed during a prayer service, and initially, she was moving her hips under her own power, but she needed help to hold her up because her muscles were atrophied. But within a month, she was walking completely under her own power. And the first video that shows when she initially got healed, some skeptics said, "You call that walking? Look, she needs somebody to hold her up." A month later, what do they say? The best skeptical response I saw to it then was, "Well, she must have faked being paralyzed for 22 years." Who's going to fake being paralyzed for 22 years? I mean, that's pretty demanding to have to do that. Sometimes the skeptical responses, skeptics need to be more skeptical of their skepticism and be open to what is often a much simpler explanation.
So some have also offered this explanation for the Juan Miguel Pellicer case, where he had one leg for years and years, and everyone was seeing him with one leg, and the doctors who amputated him must have faked that also, and he kept
And
this secret for years and years. And but yeah, I mean, who
they said
believes
that
the
he had
truth
the bottom of his leg, he had it tied behind his, you know,
of that?
tied up. That would cut off the circulation. He'd certainly lose it after a while anyway. It's just the absurdity of of the arguments that people make sometimes. I mean, not every claim is authentic, but if you're not open to any claims, please don't claim to be open-minded.
Exactly. So I would say that there's an a priori rejection of the supernatural when we speak with these kinds of skeptics.
Yeah.
They start from the conclusion that Christianity cannot be true, and so no matter the amount of evidence you bring them, they will never believe in it. And so the question I like to ask atheists is, what kind of evidence would convince you and make you change your mind and say, "Oh, I believe in miracles now"? Give me your standard, give me your criteria, necessary and sufficient conditions. And sometimes they say, well, if there was like a leg growing back, or an amputated limb growing back, I would believe it. Oh, well, we have cases. Juan Miguel Pellicer, Bruce Van Natta, and other guys like that. We can bring some of these cases, but it's funny. So my strategy is to do that. Ask them their criteria and then build from that.
Yeah. Josh Brown and I were on Justin Brierly some time ago, and there was someone who is known for debunking cases, and sometimes his debunking is probably correct, but he was so, right out to debunk everything. But I'm just bringing that up uh, because my colleague on there, Joshua Brown, is a professor of neuroscience at Indiana University, who himself has been healed and has witnessed blind eyes opened and all sorts of other things. And he just said, okay, give me your standard of what you would expect. Okay, well, here we can meet that standard. We have clearly diagnosed organic caused blindness, healed afterwards, published in a journal. And even though it was organic, the response was, well, maybe it was just psychosomatic. It's like, if you're not going to accept the evidence, why ask for evidence? But anyway,
Sure. Especially when they ask for peer-reviewed journals with such evidence, and you can provide us with some of these cases that are peer-reviewed. So we
yeah,
do have this kind of evidence.
yeah, yeah. And
Well, thank you,
Lourdes,
Craig.
yeah,
Thank you, Craig, for coming. And perhaps we could get you here once again to talk about your work on any subject. You're always welcome to come do your presentations. It's very helpful for the kingdom and for all of us to listen from you. So thanks again for coming, and see you next time.
thank you so much, Matthew. It's very good to be with you.